Hi, I hope you're doing well today. Those of you who had to stay home because you're either COVID positive or you are in the COVID protocol, I appreciate you coming and paying attention to the information that I'm posting here in Canvas. I want to say first off, I'm sorry it's so late today. I did a 40-minute video earlier and I went to post it and Canvas ate my video. So I have to do this over again, and I'm running out of voice. So I'm going to be a little more terse this time. I want to keep it to somewhere around 15 to 20 minutes, which, when you think about it, is probably about the way that a class operates. I talk for about that much, and the rest of the time you are writing, you're responding to my questions, you're in small groups thinking about things. So, I encourage you to pause occasionally during this video and think like you're in the classroom and you're processing the information. Like I said, I'm just about talked out, so I'm going to be hitting my water bottle quite a bit. I do apologize for that. Today in class, we talked about two stories. We talked about the garden party and a clean, well-lighted place. To begin with, we started with a quick write, and the quick write is in Canvas in Module 1 under Quick Writes. And I'd like for you to go there, read the quick write topic, and then sit down and write for about 15 minutes, just as you would have done in class. Go ahead, I'll wait for you. Oh, I don't have a watch. Okay. I assume you went and you did that, and now you're back, or at least you're probably going to do it later. The question, as you saw, or you will see, is I asked you to start turning your attention to characters, because that's really what we're focusing on a lot today in class. And in particular, I wanted you for the quick write to think about a character in either a movie or a book that you find really interesting, for whatever reason. Somebody who's a protagonist who undergoes a change, somebody who is influenced by other people, somebody who, for whatever reason, really grabs your attention. And I asked you to write about that person and tell us what happens to the character in the story, what influences him or her, and why did he call you in the first place. So we had some interesting examples from the class. Somebody mentioned the comedy Step Brothers and how they changed. Somebody else mentioned Apocalypse Now, and we had a couple other little examples like that. The thing is that you don't have to think too hard to think of characters who really draw you in. From there, we turned our attention to the two stories that we read, Catherine Mansfield's A Garden Party and Ernest Hemingway's A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. And I asked just the class live to quickly summarize what happens in those two stories. And what they basically came up with was in a clean, well-lighted place, Hemingway describes three men that sort of are in the three different stages of life. One man's a very old man. He's over 80. He's nearly deaf. He's lost his wife. And the week before our story starts, he tried to commit suicide, but his daughter brought him down. The second man is a little bit younger than that. He's an older older waiter at the cafe, and he sort of understands what the old man is going through, and he keeps asking his fellow worker, a younger cafe worker, a younger waiter, to be a little more patient with the old man, to try to empathize with him. And that's one of the themes we talked a lot about today, to try to empathize with the old man and to understand what he's going through. But the young man is too young. He hasn't had that kind of suffering in his life, and he just wants to get home to see his wife. And he's mad that because the old man sits in the cafe till 2:30 every morning drinking his brandy because he has nothing else to do, keeps him from going home. The old man, as I said, is deaf and is going deaf, and I think he just wants a good, safe, clean place where he can sit around other people without interacting and participate in a ritual that he does every night. It's not a great existence. It's kind of depressing. But the middle-aged man, the guy in the middle of the three, understands that sometimes you get to that point in life where all you want is that solitude amongst other people. The other story that we read, The Garden Party, is about a girl named Laura Sheridan, whose family lives in New Zealand and is throwing an opulent garden party. They're a well-to-do family. They invite people in. They have a band. They fix things up. They have food. It sounds like quite the shindig. And Laura is at the age where she's just gotten old enough to take on some of the responsibility for planning the party. So it's kind of a coming-of-age story in some ways. As she starts planning the party, we start learning a little bit more about her, and we realize she's kind of supercilious, that she looks down her nose a little bit at others, that she judges things naively sometimes. But she also starts learning lessons. At one point, she looks over and sees one of the poorer gardeners working and smelling a lavender plant. And at that point, she sort of realizes that the person she paid no attention to, just bossed around, also has a sense of aesthetics and likes the smell of that plant. So I think she's starting to learn a little something as we get deeper into the story. While she's planning the party, she hears that a neighbor of hers has been in a car wreck and has died. The neighbor is from the poorer part of town, right below their mansion. He's down in what's called the Lanes. And Laura's first response is that she thinks the family should cancel the garden party. That would be rude to have a party when a family's grieving below them. Her brother and sisters and mother all refuse to do that and say, we can't do that. This is our biggest thing of the year. But they agree to make a basket and get some flowers and have Laura take it down to the widow. So Laura goes down, immediately feels as though she's intruding upon the poor people, that she's overdressed, that she's too fancy, that she's out of place, that she shouldn't be there. The widow sees her, though, invites her in, and takes her to go see the corpse of her husband. And she sees that Laura sort of has a weird reaction. She sees it as a celebration of life. It's almost like a yin and yang. To have life, you also have to have death. And she gets a little almost giddy with it in some ways. It's hard to figure out what exactly the epiphany is that Laura has. But it has to do with understanding changes in class, understanding that people are different, but then also understanding that there is more to life than sort of the garden party world that she's lived with up to this point. So that's about what the students came up with. And then I put them in small groups and gave each small group a question that I asked them to look at. A lot of the questions are a bit redundant, or they follow up on some of the ideas I just talked about, so I'll go through them fairly quickly, but here they were, and I'm going to need my glasses for this. Sorry about that. First was, what are the main themes of the garden party? What do you think is most important? And I said that we said that the main themes were class difference, that things aren't always fair, that we base things upon class. At least they did in New Zealand at that time, and still do most places. And also an awareness that as you age, there's another side to life. It's not just garden parties. It's also death, and you have to come to grips with that. It's also that sense of what I keep coming back to, this sense of empathizing with a person other than yourself, a person with a different experience. And Laura, I think, really learns to do this here. She empathizes with the poor family who just lost the man of the house, something that her brother and sisters don't seem able to do. Next question was, can you find points of comparison, plot, character, theme, points of view, language, etc., between a clean, well-lighted place and the garden party? Make a list and then talk about how they differ as well. Well, we talked about how in both of them, the sense of empathy is important. We just talked about the garden party, but also in a clean, well-lighted place, the slightly older cafe worker, the server, certainly has empathy for the old man, because I think he's slowly turning into that old man. And after his cafe shuts down, he goes to a bar, which is not as nice of a place, gets a cup of coffee and launches into a sort of parody of the Lord's Prayer. Nada be thy name, in nada come, in kingdom nada, yada, yada, yada. It keeps going on and on, nada being, of course, Spanish for nothing. He's a typical Hemingway character in that he's sort of having an existential crisis, where he's realizing that there are no real set rules for life. Nothing is necessarily etched in stone or easy as just A or B, good or bad. Instead, like most Hemingway heroes, he has to make his own way. He has to come up with his own sort of rituals that he's going to follow. And for him, he has to sort of stay out until the dark is over, until it's morning light, and then he can fall asleep. He's probably, like a lot of Hemingway's heroes in his other books, a veteran of World War I, and reminds us of the chaotic time that this short story is set, about a decade past World War I. The World War I time was particularly devastating for Europeans, in that in the war they lost about 40 million people, and immediately after the war had the great Spanish influenza that killed an additional 50 million people worldwide. So it was just a time of death and devastation. And the soldiers that came out of World War I came back to a place where they hadn't really identified things like PTSD. So there was no way to deal with the shell shock, which is what they called PTSD back then, that they had faced. And so you had a lot of people like the middle-aged bartender there, or middle-aged waiter, or like Jake Barnes in The Sun Also Rises, who when they finally leave the crowd, when they get away from the bar or the restaurant and go home by themselves, they can't fall asleep. They're stuck with the visions of what they've been through, with their own identity, and they just have to try to make it to the next day. And I think that's what we're seeing in the middle-aged waiter in this story. He's empathizing because he's going through that as well. So, that's one of the things that these two stories have in common. There are other things as well. There's certainly a point of view. Both of them play with point of view. We mostly get a point of view through Laura's mind in The Garden Party, sort of an unfiltered, this is what she's thinking, whereas Hemingway is much more sort of concise. He at various times takes us through different points of view, but mostly through that middle-aged guy, because he sort of represents the median between the two. Laura Sheridan is the protagonist of The Garden Party, reads the next question. Describe what she is like at the beginning of the party and how she differs from her family. Does she change? And I think that has to do with the empathy that we talked about earlier. Can you draw any connections between the four stories we've read so far this semester? A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, A&P, The Garden Party, and The Story of an Hour. I think what they said in class is that they all basically featured a character who's undergoing something momentous, something that's very hard to deal with, the process. And as readers, we get to see what they have to do. What do I do now that I quit my job to impress some girls who've now left? And I know that I have to be the kind of person that keeps doing things like this for the rest of my life. What do I do now that I understand that the people down below in the poorer part of town that I've treated so badly also have rich, full lives, and they're going through things that are just as traumatic as what I'm going through? Those are the kinds of questions that most of these four stories ask us to confront. Had Mrs. Chopin, or had Mrs. Mallard lived in The Story of an Hour, it would be the same thing for her. How do I go on living now that I've tasted freedom and it's been snatched away from me? So one of the reasons we talk about what these stories have in common is it's a chance for us to start thinking about, okay, how would I turn this into a paper? How can I connect 2 or 3 stories that have a similar theme going through them? How could I compare and contrast these things off each other? And that often leads to fuller, more complex essays for your first essay. You will be writing on James Joyce's James Joyce's short stories in Dubliner, but you can always compare something in Dubliners to one of these other short stories. So just let's keep ticking those off in the back of your mind. And the last question I asked the group was, in terms of writing style, what words would you use to describe Hemingway's short story? How would you describe Mansfield's? And what I said is, with style, Hemingway is sort of the 20th century journalistic style. He uses shorter sentences, almost no complex sentences. They're just either simple sentences or compound sentences. He stays away from adverbs, and he sort of strips away all the ornamentation. Even his dialogue, and he uses a lot of dialogue, even his dialogue, though, doesn't have tags. It's not a quote, and then the older waiter said. The younger waiter replied, nothing like that. It's just the quotes itself, and you have to sort of pay attention and figure out who's saying what in there. Hemingway had a style that he called the iceberg theory of writing. Like an iceberg only has 10% above the waterline and the rest is below and you can't see it. A story should be like that. You understand the 90% of what your character is going through, but you just have to give the reader that 10% so that there's a real sense of weight beneath what we see on the surface there. Mansfield, on the other hand, is more of sort of a 19th century writing style. It's a little bit more florid, a little more descriptive, longer sentences, beautiful in its own way, but very, very different. The thing is, everybody's got a different sense of what they appreciate, your own sense of aesthetics. What you like may very well be not what I like or the person sitting next to you in class likes. But it's important to start paying attention to these different styles and seeing how they vary from other writers as you start thinking about what you privilege in a writer, what you like in a writer, what you like in this writer versus that writer, in terms of style, in terms of organization, in terms of dialogue, point of view, all those sorts of issues like that. I hope this is making sense. The last thing we did is we sort of prepped the way for Wednesday's class by preparing for a creative writing assignment. In class, I not only like to do analytical quick writes, I like to do creative quick writes too. I ask you to play the role of being a short story writer or a poem writer so that you get a sense of what it's like to not just consume literature, but to create it. And to do this, I talked about the way that so many writers get inspiration for what they write from their own lives. Hemingway wrote a lot about the scenes in Michigan where he grew up, as he liked to fish and hunt. Or he wrote a lot about World War I, where he enrolled and ended up getting hit by a fragment and spent months in a hospital in Milan. So his first big book focused a character named Jake Barnes, who also was hit by a mortar shell, had to recover in Milan, and then went to Paris, where Hemingway moved to, and lived and tried to become a writer. There are a lot of differences between Hemingway and his character Jake. But that was the inspiration. That's where he sort of got the genesis. Writers often do that. They write about something that came out of their life, and then they fictionalize it. They get to take it that extra degree. They get to do stuff with it that's beyond what happened in their own life. And so I showed everybody in class something that I've done before, and I drew sort of a map of the main house that I grew up in when I was a kid. And I put, the two-frame house, and then I lived next to a cemetery, so I put the cemetery in there, and I had a gravestone there, and I told them about a poem I wrote about the gravestone I could see when I had morning coffee. I talked about the owner of the house who hanged himself in our attic. I wrote a poem about him, got published. I lived about 4 miles from the Antietam battlefield in Maryland, and so I talked about metal detecting in our little where we grew our crops and finding Civil War bullets and all these sorts of things like that. I put as many stories down as I could. Talked about the kid that lived across the street from me, Tommy Coffeen, who's one of those kids that every neighborhood has, the guy who gets you into trouble. I told him about a short story I wrote that featured the time that Tommy woke me up on a summer day, said, let's break into Mrs. Van Meter's barn. And we did that, and didn't hurt anything, but went in there and looked, and there were a bunch of 1940s vintage autos. that looked like they'd been in there untouched for, probably 40 years. Really, memorable stuff. Terrible thing to do, but that's what a Tommy Caffeine gets you into. And so what I asked everybody to do at the end of the hour was to quickly jot down just a rough outline. And don't worry about your artistic ability. You can label things if you can't make them look real. My monkey looked like a mouse, by the way. But put down just a few things that remind you of some of the big events that happened to you, whatever house you most consider the house you grew up in. And again, you might think of, the big moments in your life, when you learned to drive a car, when you had your first kiss, when you got in trouble for doing something bad, when you had a pet that you really loved, when you first dunked the ball on in your backyard hoop. Whatever it is that you look back now and you're like, yeah, that's a pretty big moment in my life. That could be something that you might want to fictionalize and turn into a story or an element in a story. It could go someplace then after that. So between now and Wednesday, do the quick write that we had for today, and you can get that in Module 1. Make this map, this rudimentary map, and bring it with you when you come and click in Canvas on Wednesday and see the video I left for you then. And make sure to read Herman Melville's Bartleby the Scribner, which we are reading and discussing in class on Wednesday. Again, I'm sorry that you're all in the COVID protocol. I hope you're doing okay. If you are too sick to participate, just shoot me an email. I'm not going to count anybody as absent during this period of time. So just take care of yourselves. Be careful around your family. If you get tested negative, call the school and let them know, and they can, hopefully get you back in the class as soon as possible. I'm sorry this took so long to, like I said, get up, but I did a much better job the first time recording this, but hopefully this one will take. I'll see you one way or another on Wednesday, I hope. Take care.